with the release of the PS5 Pro, and look, let's not go down that rabbit hole of was it needed and why is it so much money without a disk drive and no vertical stand? What have you been smoking, Sony? Did you not see how you're behaving? Do we have to send you back to the naughty step again like 2007?
It requires huge financial investment, 599 US dollars, but we must take risks to reap the rewards. 599 US dollars. Another exciting aspect is the ability for consumers to make microtransactions to 599 US dollars.
Yeah, we don't forget. Sorry. Lost my cool there for a minute. Went down a rabbit hole. Where was I? Yes. The impending announcement as well of Switch 2, which could potentially be coming any day now. If you listen to any known leaker at this point, there's going to be an announcement any week. Maybe this week's the week. Who knows? I don't know. This 4-year-old Series S, the Series X's often forgotten cousin, who, while absolutely fine, just doesn't really hold a candle to his much more successful relative, much to his delight around Christmas when all the family like to point it out to him. But it is increasingly under the spotlight, no longer for this consumer-friendly price point it has, but for the fact that games are skipping out on Xbox or at least coming significantly later. Asking the question, is the Series S on the way out? Mainly because of the parity clause here. This is one of the major issues, that they're being potentially delayed or skipping. Now, what I want to look for in this is the reason games are missing out on the platform. Now, is it to do with the Xbox's big deal breaker of parity between the consoles? I kind of think it might be. Because it's one of the main reasons that Baldur's Gate 3 launched 3 months after it did on PS5. And then eventually Xbox went, well, we'll waive parity for them, which made the S launch with missing features. Now, look, as well, we've got to look at the effects that it's potentially having on development and if it has actually held back the generation overall, particularly as we move forward into the latter half of the generation, obviously signified by this mid-gen refresh. And when we head towards the latter portion of the generation, developers understand this system a lot more and they know what to get out of those systems much more. And considering the disparity between the two, I wonder if they're just not going to be able to push as hard because of that, or whether it's just going to be left behind the dust. Well, let's start by looking at the hardware, the S to start with. Now, in theory, this sounds like a great idea, right? You've got Game Pass strategy from Xbox that they've been hardlining all through this generation. Now, obviously, that's worked out well for them. And honestly, I've got Game Pass, and I don't even own an Xbox. I have a PC, and it's worked out great for them there. Right? But still, the console, as a concept, is a great idea. It's effectively a cheaper version with no disk drive, effectively dubbing it that Game Pass machine. Considering the hardware differences compared to the X, you're opening yourself up. It's now begun to present a lot of issues. Look, we can go back to Baldur's Gate 3 in this. And look, you can also potentially get down the Black Myth Wukong one. But again, that's a whole other story. This generation is weird. I never thought we'd get to a point where a corporate conspiracy would be something we're actually talking about. Where Xbox accused them of having an informal exclusive agreement. That's baffling. But they still maintain that it was hardware differences. But still, the main difference between the two comes to how many teraflops the system have. Now, teraflop is effectively the speed of the computing power, with the Series X having 12 teraflops, but the S only having 4, which means it's less than half as fast. And while most of these games generally still play well on the S, Baldur's Gate 3 launched with missing features, namely the split-screen co-op was absent from the Series S release. Now with the PS5 Pro having more advanced hardware, which, from the specs, it mainly boils down to a GPU, and of course the S has 4, and the PS5 Pro, we now know, has 16.7 teraflops. Over 12 difference between the S and the PS5 Pro, and a 4 teraflop difference from the X model and the PS5 Pro. That's quite a difference, but the difference they've got is the developers have the discretion if they choose to optimize for the PS5 Pro, which is a good thing. It does take more time and resources, but this is in contrast to the X and the S. So I should remind you, have a parity across both. They have to optimize for both to launch on the system, which is great for gamers, but not so good for developers if they're struggling. And of course, there was some rumors of a potential mid-gen refresh from Xbox. It seems more of them boil down to bigger storage for the S, which is great because have you seen the size of Call of Duty these days? That's on Game Pass now. Obviously, they needed to make that bigger. But still, we've seen Xboxes become less and less invested in the Xbox hardware, with the notion that they don't care where we play their games, as long as we're playing their games. They've even said that they are interested in taking their games to more platforms. So, who knows how far that goes? And this could eventually lead them to becoming a third-party publisher, arguably similar to Sega, although Xbox didn't technically lose the console wars, they're just going to tap out in the way they're going. I mean, both do also have mascots who've 100% been coasting on those old days. And there's one big comparison here. The PS3. Now, that was a difficult to develop for system because of the architecture it used. Now, on paper, it was actually technically more powerful, but the difficulties in development structure meant that third-party releases actually were significantly lower in quality on the PS3 versions, and actually had more noticeable bugs. The S is less powerful, but does run on the same architecture, which might be a benefit here. But with games becoming more and more complicated, we run the risk of history repeating itself, and developers choosing to skip the Xbox consoles, which we have already seen. Black Myth Wukong, to raise that one, could be classed as a game of the year. In fact, it is. It's on the shortlist. And we still have no idea when it's coming to Xbox. It's still marked as TBC. A game of the year contender has missed out on Xbox, not for any particular reason that we know. And these developers will in turn move that focus over to PS5 and PC, first and foremost, which won't be good news for Xbox gamers. You place the consoles in a similar boat to the Nintendo Switch, whose hardware is arguably older and therefore has to be optimized for, meaning games come a couple of months, if not a year or so later, or depending on the port houses they use, or whether they choose to even port them in the first place. And that's the worrying thing. They could be delayed, and that might just lose them market share. Now, let's have a little look at the games. The games are very obviously the biggest part of being a gamer and a console. Consoles live and die by the games on them. So as a generation goes on, we do see games push that system further and further as they get more and more used to developing for it. Now, we saw lots of games at the end of generations pushing the machine. For example, GTA 5 was a final year game for Xbox 360 and PS3. The Last of Us was on the PS3 in its final years, and bluntly, some of the later games for the PS4 turned mine into a jet engine. Now, we have to enter the second half of the generation. So, you have to say, we really likely only have, maybe 3, 4 more years with these consoles, if that, at the end of the day. So, we did have a lot of cross-gen games, and they're no longer commonplace. Let's just put it bluntly. Cross-gen games are very commonplace for the first 2 to 3 years of the console, and we're not seeing that many of them now. So developers have obviously started slowly shifting away from those. So you could argue that was a safety blanket for the S, because they were obviously having to optimize over these massive blanket of systems, which the S was still faster and better then. So developers were developing with that idea of the older consoles. Now, by default, they want to push their games to be the best they can be. And slowly but surely, that could push the more intense games to miss out on the S. And one game that I would be scared about right now is GTA 6. Look how big and immersive those games are known for being. Rockstar might try and get every last drop of power they possibly can. Or at the very least, they will 100% take longer to launch the Xbox Series S version. But also, with Rockstar being Rockstar, I imagine Xbox would waive that immediately. They would not want that game to launch anywhere else without it going on Xbox at the same day. And Rockstar, look, they know the hype. They will have a massive lid on quality control, and they won't spare any expense. Hence why they're also against it coming to subscription services on day one, as they don't make enough money from just that subscription. Now, look, there are ways to optimize. Otherwise, the Switch wouldn't have stopped having AAA releases in maybe 2021, maybe before that. We've still got big AAA releases that are being ported over to the Switch, so we know ports can be done. Now look, not all Switch ports were created equal, with many having full frame rate issues, screen tearing, and as well as muddy and ugly textures, and often launched several months, if not a year or two after everyone else got to play the game. But if you only had a Switch or you like to play your games portably, that was still a massive benefit to you. Now, despite the fact that the PS5 Pro might have drawn the immediate attention to this, it wouldn't necessarily be wise not to look at Nintendo's next-gen offering. As despite the fact that Nintendo were just off doing their own thing. They don't kind of exist in the world of generations. They kind of go, we're over here with Nintendo, wee! And that's kind of what they do. The Switch did have a fairly significant series of third-party support, so it stands to believe that developers are also looking at doing the same for the Switch 2. Arguably more so, because of how successful the Switch 1 was, and the Switch came back off the Wii U, and that's a whole different debate, but let's not get into it. And with the Switch 2's announcement so close, we can literally almost taste it. Can you not taste it? I can taste it. It's so sweet. We do know that the Switch actually did have a lot of third-party support, and yes, some of the ports came around a year or so later. They still came. And while not all of them are good, you know, you could look at Ark. Most were largely playable. So with the potentially updated specs that could still come, it could give the Series S a good case for being around. Although, still with the parity clause might make it difficult, but who knows. So the leak specs are here, right? And we really would focus on these elements. Now, thankfully, some techie people have broken this down, and interestingly, they seem to say there's a difference with the docked and handheld aspects. What is more interesting is DLSS. Now, that DLSS is a NVIDIA technology, as the Switch will be using some custom NVIDIA chip. Now, DLSS is effectively an AI-powered software that ups the frame rate as well as output higher graphics. Effectively, it's a fancy upscaler. Let's just call it what it is. It's a fancy upscaler. So I imagine that this DLSS will only be used if it's in docked mode. I could be wrong, but that would be the most logical sense to me. But the Switch 2 looks almost comparable in specs to the Steam Deck, which I would argue is its main competition. If you had to put it into a bracket of competition, it's the Steam Deck. It's not in any competition, I'd argue, because Nintendo will release their own first and second party games. But if it was, it's in the Steam Deck. Now, it's still going to be slower than the S and the X and the PS5, although, interestingly enough, it does have more RAM than the Series S if these specs are to be believed, which would still mean it would have a smoother performance and better frame rates if they optimize it correctly. So, look, we've all gone off track here. How does all of this affect the S? Now, the most interesting part here is the fact that despite it having a slower RAM, it has slightly more capacity. Now, the most interesting part here is the fact that despite it being a slower RAM speed, that extra capacity might help it keep it on track and offset the difference. But simply put, game developers usually develop with one console in mind. Some generally start on PC and then effectively port over to a console, or some start with a console in mind and then they port it over to other consoles and PC. Now, because the PS5 has had set specs that are in line with the Xbox Series X, those can be done pretty much simultaneously, with a little bit of optimizing here and there. Like, there's not much that will likely need to be changed for the best play experience. But the S being less powerful, having those less teraflops, means that it probably has to have a much more optimized and be separately optimized, which can, of course, cause delay and in some cases a worse playing experience. Now, will we see some games launch day one on PS5, Xbox, and Switch 2? Almost certainly. But what I imagine developers will end up having is a split releases. Kind of similar to what we saw from Baldur's Gate, which launched with, obviously, the missing features we've named before, but they had it running on the X. It was the S that held that back, obviously, because they wanted to optimize for both, as is the parity clause. But I could see a situation where the X gets a version first, and the S follows along several months later. Which might be what Xbox insists. If you release it on the platform, it has to release on both, but you have a certain amount of time to do that. So those who have an S, it's still an overall win for gamers, and Xbox won't lose out on those sales and that revenue, that straight-up market share associated with the immediate launch. But as the later it comes out, though, it's more like the people will have gone and played it on PS5 or PC. Because I imagine most gamers tend to have at least a PC knocking around these days. I imagine if Xbox want to, they could work with the developers of Black Myth Wukong and achieve a similar result. And with the Series S and the Switch 2 having potentially similar hardware, it means that they would have probably port them out separately. Maybe they'd go off to a different studio that would specialize in ports to help that optimization process. But that still means there could be a year's difference. But Xbox has to give up on that parity policy for that to even be an option. And I don't know if they're going to do that. And I genuinely think that parity thing is going to cause them more harm than it's worth in the next few years. But the Switch 2 might end up keeping that S and Xbox in whole, in discussion. But Xbox just need to consider if they're still holding up the generation. As more games become powerful, do they need to let more things slide and delays for the S? And treat them almost like separate consoles. Now, basically just have the X as a powerful version that gets the version first, and then they get another version on the S. I would imagine that would make more sense. But until we see the real specs of the Switch 2, though, and the effect that the DLS will actually have, we got to hold our breath on how that's going to function. Xbox Game Pass, or as we commonly refer to it as the best deal in gaming for gamers, which is arguably slowly getting worse. And while the S is effectively being dubbed that Game Pass machine, that could now be coming to an end, as there are growing fears on a digital-only future. Not helped by games like Deadpool becoming unavailable digitally, because licenses and rights just expire, but physical copies still being available for a ridiculously high price. Now, things continuously get delisted forever, and this doesn't just go for games, this goes for streaming services as well. In fact, that might be what's exacerbated this issue. While the digital future still looks likely, I don't think there'll ever be a way that we'll get that to stop. There has become growing distrust because of the amount of delisting, and that's only becoming more and more prevalent the more things are digital only. I think we have noticed this particularly with Disney Plus, and how many things they have removed in the last few years. With the price of Game Pass's standard plan for consoles set to rise, which will vary depending on your country you live in, and probably the worst part, the fact that the standard plan will no longer include games day one. So if you were excited to play Indiana Jones, Avowed, or maybe this year's Flight Sim, if that's what you're into, knock yourselves out! But I'll never understand you. You will need that ultimate version to play those on day one unless you want to pay for them outright. And the ultimate version is generally in the UK about £5 more in general, which I'd imagine is probably very similar in each currency. And now, that doesn't sound like loads, but that could be enough to put some people off, particularly as financials for people are getting worse and worse and worse. And look, I have been saying this for a long time that this has been most likely. Sony has never done day one releases particularly often for their bigger releases at the very least. And honestly, the logic didn't work long term. Day one releases, while great for us, are probably making it difficult for developers to turn a significant profit. And avoiding those layoffs, which, to be fair, Xbox has been significantly plagued by. We could also look at this from the view of developers. Now, I don't know the sales figures for games by console, but with Game Pass, has that effect grown so that Xbox gamers are less likely to purchase games on these consoles? Which the developers have seen potentially, and the money they would make is not comparable to the amount it would cost to port it to the console. It's just the thought. But now Game Pass pretty much pays a license fee for it to appear on the platform. How much that is obviously depends on the game, how new it is, and all these other different factors. But I would imagine that's a significantly lower chunk of money than some of the bigger, more traditional AAA games would have made on release day. Now, maybe for smaller indie titles, though, this approach could actually still work quite well. They know they're going to guarantee make some money, and if they release it on multiple consoles and multiple things at the same time, it means that they're an audience already going out there and looking at it and people going, you know what, I'm going to pick that up myself. But for larger releases, I think we still need to be mindful on that impact it's going to have on developers. Now, Xbox has had other issues. The most recently seems to be the fact that they are oblivious to what is causing the issues with their games. They've even launched a developer-focused blog post asking developers to reach out. And as this comes on the heels of Entopia, a game that launched on PC and PS5 but didn't have an Xbox version at the same time, the developers actually commented on this at the time, and the reason they gave was that Xbox stopped communicating with them. Now, this feels like a way of responding to the situation, as potentially this is not the first developer that has been ghosted by Xbox. Not a term I ever thought I'd say, but you know what? Here we are. Welcome to 2024, where apparently getting ghosted by Xbox might be normal. And look, to Xbox's credit, they did get back in touch with them once the news broke, and they now seemingly resolved that issue. But the question is, between the parity concepts and these communication issues, how can they sort this out? Why are they letting their competitors have an advantage purely based on their communication issues? It's honestly mind-blowing. That is a lot of market share that's now already probably bought the game, and that's awful for the developers too. Let's wrap this up. Now, well, the PS5 Pro and the Nintendo Switch 2 are probably making Xbox have a little rethink, which is kind of evident by them reaching out to developers, changing day one releases, and making a few exceptions. It still has to be said, will the parity be ditched? Will the Series S be given a mid-gen refresh? If so, how will that work for people who've already bought one? Look, I don't know these answers. So I do think the PS5 Pro and Nintendo Switch 2 have made them have a little bit more of a think. As, you know, as well, the Switch 2 will just stay out on its own and no one will really bother it. They still have to consider the specs will line up in comparison there, and what does that offer for a developer? And from a developer's perspective, we are hearing more and more about delays regarding optimization, and of course, the Switch is a good example. Games have often come later as they've had to optimize it, and while the Series X is comparable to that PS5, the launching simultaneously might not be possible, which will affect Xbox in the long run. And that's the biggest takeaway. I don't think this is the death of the Series S, but I do think this will be the death of the parity clause, with Xbox likely having to take the hit and allow developers to release simultaneously across all platforms, with the Series S and Switch versions likely coming later, maybe even a year. And that could include a lot more changes that would be better for optimization. But I think that's still a lot of open to interpretation right now. So who knows? So yeah, we'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, guys, please like, subscribe, comment, share with a friend. Up to you, whatever you do. And thank you for being here. I'll hopefully see you very soon.